All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Alhamdulillah wa salala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. This is Amber Khan, IMANA Education Chair, and we are back with another education webinar. Tonight, we have a very special and important topic being covered. This is a warning to viewers that we will be discussing a much needed but very sensitive topic, and that is on domestic violence in Muslim families. A brief description on what will be discussed tonight is that this is a critical discussion about intimate partner domestic violence in the Muslim community. We will explore what IPV is and how it presents in Muslim communities and how Islam holds the answer to the elimination and prevention of family-based violence in our communities. I am so blessed and grateful to have a wonderful and well-known speaker, especially in the Muslim Research Department, and that is Dr. Denise Ziya Berte. She's Executive Director of the Peaceful Families Project. It is a 21-year-old US-based nonprofit organization that aims to address issues on family-based violence, using Islamic values and models through training, research development, and strategic affiliations. So before Dr. Denise gets started, I would love to introduce her. Dr. Denise Ziya Berte is a licensed clinical psychologist in Pennsylvania, Delaware, and the state of Palestine for over 25 years. She has a specialty in trauma, interpersonal violence, and indigenous populations. Dr. Berte has written over 17 published professional articles, 3 book chapters, and presented on over 100 occasions internationally related to the topics of specialty. Dr. Berte is also a forensic psychologist who has evaluated over 1,000 individuals and served as an expert witness in cases involving criminal, family, and immigration and human rights laws. She has previously served as the Director of Children and Adolescent Services for Community Behavioral Health in Philadelphia, the Executive Director of the Liberty Center for Survivors of Torture, and the Vice President of the Latin American Community Center in Wilmington as the Clinical Director of the An-Najah Child Institute and as a professor in the medical faculty at the An-Najah National University of Palestine. Without further ado, firstly, Dr. Denise, on behalf of the IMANA community, we are so grateful for you to share your expertise. We apologize for the delay. Please go ahead and get started when you're ready.
Much thanks, Shukran. I always start, first of all, that's way too much introduction. It's always very scary to hear all of that at once. What I will remind you is whatever you hear that comes out of my mouth that touches your heart is clearly from Allah. What I say that makes you uncomfortable and confused is probably likely just from me. So we don't blame Islam for any mistakes that I might make. We do want to talk right now about domestic violence in Muslim families, and we will try to leave some time for questions at the end. I think this is very important. Many of you are aware of the past sort of 8 weeks of sort of horrific incidents within our communities, where we have had 4 domestic homicides, which means an intimate partner killed both themselves and their intimate partner. In one of those cases, also children and extended family members. So we know that this is something that we absolutely have to talk about. When we looked at those victims, it's sort of we look for answers, and I'll talk a little bit about our In Their Names campaign, which is going on currently as a result of these incidents. But I think what was most sort of what made it hardest for domestic violence advocates, for people working in the field and people looking in the community, was to say there wasn't a quick answer, right? So some of those women were married, some of them were separated, some of them were already divorced. Some had sought orders of protection, some had not. Some had sought help from the masjid, some had not. Some were hijabis, some were not. Some were educated, some were not. Some were immigrants, some were not. When we looked at the victims themselves, there was no way to make sense of, so how do we protect our victims? How do we protect our families as Muslims? And we really need to look at, instead of, for many years, we've talked about how do we make safer services for women or for victims. And we'll talk, unfortunately, in the current homicides, all of the victims have been women, all of the perpetrators have been men. So when we talk about, what that looks like, people often ask, well, are there no men victims? There are. It is almost zero within the Muslim community that a man is a victim of domestic homicide. He may be a victim of domestic violence, but again, it's about 95% of the cases are male perpetrators, female victims. And that's not because women are amazing and perfect. It's because most of the time the women do not have power within society to be able to put men in situations where they are under their power and control. But when we looked at these female victims and thought about how can we make things better, we needed to look at the community, because there is some sort of message going out and causing harm not only to these female victims, but to the male perpetrators as well. Because when you get to that point of taking your own life and taking the life of your family members, you've also condemned yourself, and this is not what we want for our families. So let's talk about what domestic violence is, how do we avoid these situations, and how really Islam has so many of the answers that we need. Real quick about Peaceful Families. So Peaceful Families, as you heard, is a national in the United States, although some of our programming, such as In Their Names, is now, we have partners in Canada as well. We are a nonprofit in the United States, but with international impact. We look at education, training, resources, and what we call affiliated partnerships, which is bringing people together to work on these issues throughout the Muslim community. And actually, we've gone even beyond what's written here. So we work on domestic violence. We work on what's also called Peaceful Futures, which is curriculums for young people, because we know that the beliefs around domestic violence do not start, at 25 when someone gets married. They are planted very early. So we want to work with young people so that they have that true Islamic resolution and answers and identity around family formation. We also have programs for peaceful parenting, which is how do we raise strong young Muslims without using oppression and violence as a way of discipline. We also have a program called Peaceful Partings, which in so many of these tragic situations are around this idea that divorce is a stigma. We know, and we'll talk about this, that divorce is part of the gift that we have. We have been told that when we cannot have peace, that peacefully parting is absolutely fine. And it's cultural issues and other kinds of issues that get in the way of understanding that. So we have a curriculum around divorce and co-parenting. We also have our amazing Peaceful Partners, which is our male allies group, which is really knowing that a lot of this education has to go from men to men. So that we have strength and understanding within the community about what it is to be the leader of your home, what it is to be a good Muslim man, and what are the models for that. We also have a program called Peaceful Worlds, where we look at international issues, as well as a program we are now calling MAPI, which is Muslim abusive pattern intervention, and that is those are programs for people once they have actually engaged in domestic violence and are needing either court order treatment or some kind of classes to prove that they are working toward a resolution. Oops, go real quick. So one is, we know one of the things that we work with is that, and we see within the victims of domestic violence as well, is that our Muslim Ummah is incredibly diverse. According to the Pew Foundation, Islam is the most diverse faith community in the United States, and it includes all of these folks from diverse cultures, race, ethnicities, languages, immigration statuses, education statuses, level of religiosity, all of these things. And I think this is really important when we look at what messages people are getting around the issue of domestic violence. You all know this. Let me go through this. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about IPV in general. So talk about what's called intimate partner violence, which is this violence between spouses or people within a relationship or within the same home. Intimate partner violence is spousal, and then we have family-based violence. What's important to know about intimate partner violence is, in fact, that it is not a one-time slap. It is not a one-time argument over whether the person should go to their mother's house or not. It is not a one-time argument over credit cards. Intimate partner violence is an entire system of beliefs, whereas one person in the relationship really believes that because of their gender, status, role in the family, that their job is to control 100% those in the family, including wives, mothers, sisters, children, all of those people that they feel that are underneath their role in the family. The other thing is that this kind of behavior is patterned, right? So it doesn't happen once. It starts out with a small thing and then gets bigger. And then toward, the culmination of this, the person begins to feel that everything has to be under their control. What the person looks like, what they smell like, what they're eating, what they're doing, are they exercising, are they everything, their phone, where they go, who they talk to, the interactions that they have with their family. So that we know that it is an all-encompassing system. It includes physical abuse and sexual abuse, but also financial abuse. You're not allowed to marry. You're not allowed to accept any presents outside of what I give you. Using the children in abuse. What did your mother do during the day? Who did she talk to? It's using extended family members. It's using, the community at home. And it's also using spirituality. It's also using Islam. And there are certain verses and there are certain parts of our hadith and our Qur'an that perpetrators of domestic violence really cling to as sort of supporting this entire set of beliefs. So when we talk about how do we react, how do we manage domestic violence within our community, the first and the foremost, and the reason that we really focus on training is that we need to break that sort of idea that Islam is pro-violence, that Islam states that the husband or the father in the family should be obeyed without question, because it's almost a matter of shirk. This is not God. This is not Allah, right? So this is an individual within the home. And I think what we're going to do is take questions at the end. We're going to talk first and then grab those questions at the end. So please hold on to them. So one of the things that we have to do is not just intervene. So first of all, the idea that domestic violence is part of a mental health problem is not really true. We know that even in the cases of domestic homicide, these individuals are not going out. They are not kicking dogs. They are not attacking people on the street. They're not, stabbing bus drivers. They only use violence against family members. And that's because there is this strong belief that it is their right, not even their right, but it is their obligation to use violence within the family to control situations. And we know that that is not Islam. And we're going to talk in a minute about how that is not Islam. So we don't really focus on mental health, although obviously mental health is frequently a stigma within our community. And needs to be addressed. But the relationship between mental health and domestic violence is not clear, right? It is not, domestic violence is not caused by untreated mental illness, which is a part of the story that we like to tell. The other thing is that it's not individual, that these individuals are usually supported by a family and a community that believes what they believe. That to be a good partner, that you should be quiet, that you should be obedient, that you should follow the dictates of that person. And the difficulties, those dictates never end. They get more and more restrictive to the point where even victims who are trying their hardest to follow the rules keep changing. So that it's really important to understand that it's not just fixing an individual. We need to really change the way that our communities and many of our cultural groups talk about the relationship between men and women, what marriage is, and certainly what divorce being an option for peaceful parting is. So let me actually go to the Quran. What I like about this part is it is not my opinion. Please fact check. Please go back and look at these verses because we want to talk about what Islam is. And what it is not. So let's talk about what gender looks like in the Quran. So in the Quran, we are told that as men and women, we are created from a single soul. We hear that always at wedding, at wedding celebrations, and then sometimes we forget about it. This is equality, right? This is more equality than is talked about in Christianity and Judaism. Islam was created to really fix the problems of the faith traditions before. So it was very clearly stated. Men and women are created from a single soul. That men and women are both created to worship Allah. That is our only obligation. That we are not to follow an individual, ever a human being. That our job is to worship Allah and to follow the example of Rasulullah, of our Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And that the instructions that we are given in the Quran is that men and women are mutual friends and protectors of one another. As believers, it is our job to tell each other, to enjoin what is good and to let someone know when they are not following what is Islam. And that includes acting in ways that are oppressive or unhealthy for the family. We know that marriage in the Quran, and I love this verse because it's very clear about what our goal is for marriage in the Quran. Our goal is that husbands and wives are garments for one another. We provide mutual care, love, and protection, but that marriage is based on love, compassion, and mercy, with the goal being tranquility, sakina. That we are created to make peaceful places where strong Muslims can grow and fight the battles that they need to fight in the world against evil, against shaitan, not against each other. So when we talk about, and this is also, I love this verse because it doesn't talk about we need to produce children, we need to make houses, we need to make a lot of money. The only goal of an Islamic marriage is to create a place of peace, is to create a place where strong Muslims can grow, can develop, can rest when they need to rest, and go about their business of being good Muslims. Now, we know that there is gender equity and that we are different by design. So we do not say that men should not be the leaders of their home, but that they should be good leaders, just leaders, not violent and oppressive leaders, because we know the Islamic stance on violence and oppression. Islam prohibits abuse, and we know these verses very well. The Muslim is one from whose tongue and hand every Muslim is safe. O you who believe, nor should you treat them, women, with harshness. On the contrary, live with them on a footing of kindness and equity. Right? And we know that this is not, unfortunately, what a lot of our households look like, where there is yelling of vulgarities. We're also told in the Quran that we do not use bad names, we do not use bad words. But our homes do not always look like the Islam that we are taught. As well, and we'll talk about Hadith in a moment, it doesn't look like the example that we are given from our Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. When we talk about using faith to justify abuse, that this is absolutely not allowed in Islam, but it's certainly something that is used in Muslim communities today. Telling victims, well, you're a bad Muslim. If you were a good Muslim, I wouldn't have to hit you. If you were a good Muslim, you would never burn the rice. If you were a good Muslim, you wouldn't talk to your mother on the phone every day. All of these kinds of things that really try to present Allah as a partner in the abuse, to restrict outside sources of teaching. You can only listen to what I have to say. Again, that begins to sound like someone who wants to replace Allah. That this leadership position, we know that leadership within Islamic communities is not based on violence and oppression, that it is based on mutual consultation, that it is based on mutual understanding, that it is based on compassion and respect. Now, there are these verses that get us into trouble a little bit, and I do want to bring those up. So, and of course, this is Anisa verses 34 and beyond. Men are the protectors and the maintainers of women because Allah has given one more strength than the other, because then they support them from their means. The righteous women are devoutly obedient to Allah, not to a husband, to a father, to a brother, to a son, to Allah, and guard in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. As to those women on whose part you fear nushuz, disloyalty and ill conduct, and I want to be really clear about what this means. This is disloyalty and ill conduct, breaking the laws of Allah, not breaking what one person may want, okay? Not what one individual may want. We're talking about extraordinary behavior that is against the rules of Allah. First, we refuse to share their beds. First, we admonish them. Next, refuse to share their beds. And last, this idea of hitting, tapping, or separating from them. But if they return to obedience, seek not against them. Means of annoyance, for Allah is most high, great, and above you all. When we look at these verses, it's very clear. We are not talking about beating someone. We're not talking about getting a gun and shooting someone. We're talking about an attempt to educate someone. And this is also the situation when you have decided that this is someone that you want to continue a life with. Because the first, and we'll talk about, the first option is always this idea of peaceful parting. So I want to make sure that we are not confused about these verses. These are not verses that tell us that domestic violence is okay. We also have been given direct instruction about what we do when we see abuse. Now, this is all of us. This is not perpetrators. This is not victims. This is all of us who have brothers, sons, nephews, community members, where we see something wrong happening. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, help the oppressed and the oppressor. And the companion said, we know how to help the oppressed, but how do we help the oppressor? And the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, replied, by preventing him from committing injustice. And we know that we have been told, we first with our hands, we then with our mouth, and then within our minds, we never accept that abuse is allowed. Now, there are some cultural issues that come up because culture is not perfect. And the places where we live that have been colonized and have had war and have other kinds of models other than Islam's have planted things inside of our communities that were never intended to be parts of Islam. So we know that within some cultures, women may be held responsible for the success or failure of a marriage. That family and community support varies widely for women who are choosing to leave, and support from religious leaders may reduce guilt, help seeking and leaving. So we know that we as community members have that power with our hands, with our mouths, and with our minds to support people who are saying no to this oppressive model of marriage, which again was never part of Islam. There are, again, some cultural expressions of domestic violence, the threats to ruin reputation. I'm going to tell everyone you're a terrible mother, you're a terrible wife. I'm going to talk about our intimate life to your parents, to our community. There may be, unfortunately, in our communities, not only a spouse, which is intimate partner violence, but also family-based violence. So that might be a mother-in-law, it might be a brother, it might be a father. It may be transnational, right? So that we have these stories that go from here to whatever home of origin is and back here again. Take this idea of I'm taking my children overseas, so where you don't have the rights to see them, and interfering with how the victim chooses to practice or not practice her own religion of Islam. We also know that there are cases of forced marriage, and we want to be very clear about this idea of arranged marriage is not forced marriage. Forced marriage is when somebody clearly is stating that they do not want to marry the individual that has been selected, and that they are threatened and many times forced, taken away, locked up, have their rights restricted because they are refusing. Again, the reason that we have marital contracts in Islam is to protect the rights of both parties within a marriage. We also know that there are some spiritual abuse patterns, withholding religious divorce or threats to divorce, refusing to pay the mahr, threats to take a second wife, and keeping marriage secret, which is not Islamic in any way. We may ask, why do victims stay? It sounds terrible. It sounds like a terrible life. Why do they stay? One is, of course, is the messages that we get from our communities and from our parents. The idea that this is a socially acceptable living arrangement. I don't want to be divorced. There's a shame in being divorced. That there is economic stability in some cases. That it provides safety from gossip and blame. That there is this idea of providing a stable home for my children, immigration status, which may play a part, a shared history. Most victims do not want to leave the perpetrator. They just want the abuse to stop. And where is this person going to go? Either an unfamiliar place, a shelter that may not be culturally sensitive, with the threat of losing her children, separations from older children if they are in shelter. And then what are the consequences? Possible blame from family and community, including increased scrutiny. One of the horrific pieces of the second of the fourth homicide that we saw, Sister Sania, who was writing so much about what her actual experiences were as a divorced woman within her culture, about how her family said horrific things to her, about her ex-partner who continued to threaten her and in the end took her life, and the struggle of living alone and living with this idea of shame all of the time. Shunning by the community, being really had your back turned on by the community, the loss of stability, home, finances, custody, all of those things as well. So what are best practices? One is that we want to look at the importance of religion and spirituality within our community, that we are believers, and what do we do as believers? We also want to take seriously trauma history. We want to understand what has happened within this relationship previously. And we also know, and one of the reasons, unfortunately, why people do not, in fact, report is this idea of geopolitical events. There's so much Islamophobia. There's all of these other things going on. If we talk about how violent Muslims can be to each other, this will be used against us. And this, in fact, is used against victims because they really do hesitate to report because of this. We always want to look at cultural norms about gender roles and work within paradigms to empower people around us, to let them know that culture is not religion. We want to focus on safety and well-being of each member of the family, including the abuser, which is to say, in the 4 cases that we have of domestic homicide in this past 6 to 8 weeks, is that none of the perpetrators survived also. They have all decided to use suicide as a way to end their lives as well. And that's not good for any of us. So this is a problem for all of us. And we need to reframe really culture and religion as a resource, as something that works in our favor. And I want to talk about, so family and shame and honor. So this idea that it is shameful for a victim to break her family, that is shameful to report, that is shameful to air dirty laundry. And the same way, we can turn that around. We can talk about how shameful it is for men to abuse someone, to oppress someone. We can talk about how shameful it is to break a marriage by using oppression, by using violence. We can talk about how shameful it is not to seek help, to protect family members, to stand up against oppression, because that is what Islam stands for. We can also reframe this idea of obedience, right? So we know that survivors are many times told that to obey 100%, a father, a brother, a husband is the way of being a good Muslim woman. But we also know that Allah forbids all forms of oppression and commands us to justice and to call people to justice, even when it involves ourselves. We know that a husband's leadership should be patterned after the Prophet, peace be upon him, who used consultative, collaborative, non-coercive, and servant leader model. We know that our Prophet, peace be upon him, was the best of husbands, that he helped in the house, that he did not ever raise his hand unless in jihad. We know that his respect for his wives and his daughters was unprecedented, that it was a model for the community. And when we use that as our model for marriage, it becomes very clear how Islam can be the answer instead of the problem. We also want to talk about this idea of haram, right? Of sin, that survivors are told that leaving a marriage is haram because Allah hates divorce. I heard, the shaitan laughs every time a couple gets divorced. We also know that oppression is a sin, and a much bigger sin, because oppression is something that we are not given an answer to. We are never told you are allowed to commit oppression. We are told clearly to live together in kindness or to separate in kindness, that divorce is a peaceful alternative to enduring ongoing oppression. The idea of forgiveness, a lot of times this is what women are told, right? Have sabr, have patience, forgive the abuser, hold on to the marriage and tolerate this abusive behavior. Now, forgiveness does not have anything to do with staying in an abusive relationship. Forgiveness has to do with freeing your heart from the desire to hurt that other person. The perpetrator is the one who is responsible for seeking forgiveness for themselves to the individual and also to Allah. Forgiveness does not require staying in a marriage where you are being abused. Okay. So that is the major part of sort of our slides. And I want to open it up for questions and concerns that you might have around this issue.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, Dr. Denise. You really gave us a lot of information to take in. A couple things that I wanted to highlight that you mentioned. You spoke about beautifully the verses that are in the Qur'an that talk about marriage goals, that it's not about reproduction, it's not about maintaining the home, it's about garments and love and compassion. And in terms of equity, men are to be good leaders. It was very beautifully stated. I also like the way when you talked about that very controversial verse, very misunderstood. It's quite shocking that the very verse which Allah revealed to prohibit domestic abuse is the same verse that critics use to prove, Islam's support of violence. But I love the way you highlighted how it mentions very explicitly in that verse how women are devoutly obedient to Allah. You spent a lot of time talking about how that we are not to give any other person absolute obedience, that is a liken to shirk. A question that I have for you is, what can we say to those who do come from families who put the fear of the stigma of divorce over the safety and unfulfilled rights? For someone who may be listening who's in that predicament, how can they handle that situation?
Yeah, for right now, this is really one of my biggest concerns as a public health person, as somebody who's trying to work with victims, because we can only help victims, once they make that step. The other thing I want people to know is that taking that step toward divorce, unless all of the community understands that this is a peaceful parting, is the time when women are most at risk for homicide and severe violence. That it is when the marriage is breaking, it is not easy to leave, not only because it's culturally, economically, but it's not easy to leave because that really is the time when perpetrators begin to feel that they're losing control and become much more violent. In almost all of the cases that we hear about, women tell people, this will not work. He will find me. He will kill me. And we sort of put, no, he's such a nice guy. He's wonderful. He goes to the mosque. He prays. This would never happen. But women know. So one thing I want to remind people is that divorce quick, you should separate is not always the answer, that is the time that is most dangerous. This is a message that needs to go to both the men and the women within our communities, the mother-in-laws, the sister-in-laws. Everyone needs to understand that divorce is a peaceful option that we are given from Allah, because Allah knows that we are not perfect, and we should know that as well, right? That this idea of reputation of the family, There is no statement of you should be married for reputation of the family in the Quran ever, right? That you should do this for the reputation of your parents, that you should do this, that divorce is a disgrace. This is nowhere in the Quran. It is nowhere. And our prophet, peace be upon him, and we don't talk about this very often, divorced twice. So we know that it is not a sin. We know that it is not a bad thing. So what we need to do, and it's not only the victims listening, but it's the mothers and the mother-in-laws and the brothers and the uncles, all of whom like to talk about, look at this, look at how disgraceful it is, look what you're doing to your parents. Absolutely not. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, anjad, alhamdulillah, that we are given a way out of situations of oppression always. That Allah's plan for no one is to be in a relationship that is so toxic that the only way we see out is death. That can never be okay. And I am repeating this more frequently of late, given the urgency of the recent tragedies, is that the perpetrators themselves are condemning themselves. The victims, inshallah, will be in paradise. When you tell your son, or you tell your your son-in-law, or you tell your brother, this woman is disgracing you, you have to show honor to our family, in a violent way, you are condemning that individual to either death or prison, because we know that that's what happens both here in the United States and even internationally. So we need to take responsibility, not just to talk to victims, but to talk to everyone within our communities. We need to talk to people before they get married. We need to talk to people as they are going through the struggles of everyday life of marriage. And we need to talk to people, especially when a decision has been made to separate and to divorce.
Yes, very beautifully stated. I think one of the things you also pointed out was that abusers, they think it's their obligation, and that they're further supported by family or the community who, continues to fulfill the mindset that they already have driving in them. And given those recent events, the horrendous events that have been occurring, and we saw the PFP statement that was given, from your experience and based on your organization, how can we as a community help those who are survivors of domestic violence? And as you mentioned, it's beyond divorce. It's something in which this person's life is at risk and continues to be at risk. What advice do you have for us as a community to spread awareness and be a means of protection for those who are in these types of situations?
There are a couple of things that we're asking for, quick ask, and then I'll talk about sort of more general things. So we do have a program called In Their Names, which is serving two purposes. So one is that we know that when we have these horrific acts of homicide within the Muslim community, we don't talk about them. We clean, and we've seen this with the statements by imams, by family members. Tragic accident, passed away. We don't want to talk about them. But the fact that we don't talk about them leaves us a little bit in the dark about being able to prevent. So we have this newly initiated national campaign called In Their Names, and it really is to do three things. So one is to help us gather information about domestic homicide within Muslim communities. So there is if you go onto our website, there is a link. If you know of any cases of domestic homicide within the Muslim community, no matter how far back it goes, we want you to go on and we want you to fill out information, even if you're not a family member, because we need to have numbers. We don't know how many victims. We don't know their names. We don't know their situations. We don't know enough to stop the next time. So we really need that information. As part of that website, there is a place for families who have victims of domestic homicide in them to post pictures, to talk about their legacy, to have that last word about the pure life and heart of that victim. The last piece of that are going to be some public events, really to both acknowledge and honor victims of domestic homicide within our community. I think until we come to accept the fact that this happens, because many of our folks, when I go into masjids and talk, they will tell, oh no, it's just small fights about women wanting to be, Americanized and these things. We don't talk about life and death. And this is a life and death issue. So one of the things that we are going to be asking folks on this Friday, we have a spiritual session of dua for victims of domestic homicide. We have some amazing speakers. We have Imam Majid, we have Sister Salma, we have prayers and an open time for folks to share their stories. So we would ask everyone to attend who feels so inclined. On October 7th, which is the first Friday of Domestic Violence Month, we call First Friday for Families. We are going to be asking people within their masjids to talk about domestic violence, to reinstate the zero tolerance of domestic violence, to wear purple hijab and purple clothing. And then in the evening, we are going to have a national teach-in about domestic violence within the Muslim community. So we would ask you all to participate and to promote those particular activities. For those males in the listening, we have something called the Peaceful Partner Pledge. This is also on our website. It's a simple thing. You pull it up, you just click it. It says, I am a Muslim man. I am the head of my household. I do not use violence and oppression as a means to enhance my leadership. The more men that we can get to sign off on that, the more we can make it clear to all of our communities that this is not what Islamic family look like. So that is an important step. We do have also the IPV study, the intimate partner violence study, looking at Muslims. The other piece is that it has been over 10 years since any investigation of the experience of domestic violence has been done in the community. Peaceful Families is doing the re-update of that research. Again, a click on our website. We need 1,000 Muslims, men, women, no children, 18 and over, living in the United States, to fill out that questionnaire, whether you have had any experience with domestic violence or not, so that we can know what the numbers are, so that we can have some real data behind our programming. Aside from that, of course, we ask you to plant seeds every day. When you hear those comments, oh, she's controlling you. Oh, you know what kind of woman she is. Oh, even before marriage, well, you have to make sure that she's going to be able to obey you. We need to educate all day long at our barbecues. It's not just in the masjids, it's at our barbecues, it's around our kitchen tables. It's when our brothers or sisters come to us with advice. When we hear people talking, oh my goodness, she's going to get divorced, it's going to ruin the family, we need to answer that back, and we need to say, hey, aren't we Muslim? Aren't we allowed to get divorced? This is part of peaceful parting. Alhamdulillah, she's going to be safe, and that they'll both be happy. We need to confront those beliefs and those misunderstandings at every level all the time.
MashaAllah, those are some incredible resources and tips that you've given. We're going to share these links, inshallah, on the IMANA education site. May Allah put a lot of barakah in your research studies. Definitely when it comes to research, the numbers don't lie. And that'll be much more eye-opening. So I pray, inshallah, that you get a full study. I believe you also did this was a while back, 2011 survey that was done that you partnered with Project Sakina, and it talked about how 31% of American Muslims reported experiencing abuse, 53 experiencing some form, but nearly all of the women surveyed, their abuse was not a religious issue, but a cultural issue. And that, really set off a lot of alarms and, in a way of showing that, Islam, this is not from, an abuser thinking that Islam supports their view, but really just drawn in from culture. And so trying to correct culture and not ever let it supersede Islam is a great way of being able to educate the community.
Absolutely. And it's that particular data that we are redoing now, right? So it's been over 10 years. We started when it was 10 years. It's now almost 11 years that data was done. The other thing is that data was surprising and shocking, but that data was also done by a very limited socio-cultural set of folks. So we are now looking for a much more diverse and in-depth look at that same set of data.
Inshallah, inshallah. I think we have one more question for you. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I would really appreciate this last bit of advice is for someone listening, a person who is seeking marriage, and wondering how can I protect myself from being in a relationship like this? And of course, we don't blame any victim for being in the situation, but just from some of the patterns and things that you did talk a little bit about certain personality traits or qualities, but what about prior to the marriage and in looking for someone for marriage? Is there anything that you can offer that may be potentially quote unquote red flags?
Well, not only red flags, but resources. So, alhamdulillah, you're thinking about these things now. So, one of the things that we have to do is have hard conversations, and we have to have them in a calm way. We need to talk about, it's my desire to study. It's my desire to go to school, to work. It's my desire to have only 3 children. It's my desire to live in this place versus that place. It's my desire to see my parents once a week. It's really important to bring all of those things out and talk about them preemptively. We do have, and I think nationally, out of Arizona, there's going to be a virtual prenuptial class. So important, right? So it's not just you sort of poking at each other and asking each other questions, but under the guidance of an imam, under the guidance of a counselor or a mental health professional, that you have these discussions and that you make, again, we as Muslims, we're trying to marry for life, and we're not marrying for butterflies and, sort of this fake idea of love. So we should be investigating. We, of all people, have the right to ask hard questions, fill out question, not the ones you find in Vogue, but to ask hard questions, to find out who this person is, talk to, again, this is part of what we do traditionally around marriage. Talk to people, find out about their family, find out about that individual, and don't sweep things under the rug. Oh, it'll be different when he gets married. No, marriage does not make people better. Marriage is a stressor. It's increased responsibility. It's increased stress. It's increased coping skills. So marriage will never make anyone better. It will almost always make things worse that exist. So we want to find somebody who's pretty sane and stable to start with, before we add in the stress of marriage. So really talking, getting those premarital counseling sessions, getting those premarital education sessions are really important. Asking the hard questions, asking people who know the person, observe them, right? Observe them, look at how they manage. Not, everything is peaches and cream and wonderful, but when we disagree about things, how do you talk to me? How do you talk to other people? Is there still respect? Can you respect someone? Is there a history of any kind of have Again, a partner's job in marriage is not to make another person whole or better. We have to start out with functional, adult, mature beings to be able to enter into marriages that are happy and are positive.
That is incredible advice. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much. Dr. Denise, I would love to have a part 2 with you. There are so many questions that just keep coming up as you talk more. And I think we would love to have the opportunity to pick your brain a little bit more, inshallah. The IMANA community greatly appreciates your time and efforts in joining us this evening. Inshallah, we will contact you, I'm sure, in the future to hopefully get a part 2, get more information from you. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time. And we look forward to having you back in the future, inshallah.
And thank you for all of the work that you do in the community and bringing the voice of Islam in a positive way.
Alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair. So we'll go ahead and close for the evening. If you have any questions or if you would like to contact Dr. Denise, we will leave the Peaceful Families Project information underneath the webinar recording on the IMANA Education website. If you would like to look at more information, I will also be posting the upcoming, some of the courses and research that Dr. Denise had mentioned in the webinar. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much again, Denise. We look forward to having you back in the future.